The first light of dawn crept like a thief over the soot-black rooftops of London, and yet the air carried no promise of warmth. The fog lay thick as wool, clinging to the gas lamps and the window panes of Baker Street, and somewhere within that murk, a single chimney gave off a ribbon of smoke that refused to rise. It twisted downward as though pulled by invisible fingers, coiling back upon itself before vanishing into the heavy air. That strange downward smoke would prove to be the signal flare for one of the most curious and tragic episodes ever to pass beneath my friend's keen observation. A case that began not with the cry of a victim, but with the quiet sigh of a dying fire. If this tale draws you, dear listener, into the chill and intrigue of London's forgotten corners, if the scrape of carriage wheels and the distant peal of the cathedral bell quicken your pulse, I invite you to journey further with us. Subscribe, share, and stay close to the warmth of the hearth, for through its flicker we shall glimpse the heart of mystery itself. There are mornings in London that seem born not of dawn, but of ash. The day in question was one of these. A November morning when the air felt thick enough to touch, and the city appeared to exhale its own fatigue. The fog lay heavy over Baker Street, dulling the lamps until their glow resembled dying embers seen through gauze. I had risen early, drawn by the distant sound of carriage wheels and the faint whistle of a milkman on his round, when I noticed something strange beyond our window. The chimney across the street, belonging to a narrow lodging house with flaking plaster and a single crooked shutter, was emitting smoke that behaved as no smoke should. Instead of rising into the mist, it curled downward, creeping along the wall before vanishing into the fog like a living creature seeking concealment. For several minutes I watched in perplexity, believing it some illusion of the weather. Yet when I drew Holmes's attention to it, his reaction was instant and unsettling. He was sitting by the fire in his dressing gown, a half-burnt match between his fingers, his eyes fixed upon the curling wisp outside. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly, his voice sharper than the chill air. "Nature seldom errs, but men do. When smoke sinks, it is not the air that is wrong, it is the fire." He rose, the match burning down to his fingers, and extinguished it without so much as a wince. "You recall, perhaps, that criminality, like disease, leaves its own peculiar atmosphere. There, my dear fellow, is the breath of mischief." I laughed softly, thinking he jested. "Surely you don't infer villainy from an errant chimney." Holmes turned, his expression unreadable. "An errant chimney? No. But a dying fire whose smoke falls rather than rises. That, Watson, is a dying signal. Someone has extinguished more than warmth within those walls." Within the hour, we were in a hansom cab, rattling through the grey streets toward Whitechapel, where the lodging-house stood. The driver's breath plumed like steam as the horse laboured through the clinging fog. At intervals, the silhouette of a constable's lamp loomed out of the murk, then disappeared behind us. Holmes sat rigid, his eyes half closed, his mind, I knew, racing far ahead of us. When he spoke, it was in that low tone he used when the world outside had ceased to exist for him. "Consider, Watson. Smoke that descends implies a reversal of draught, a chimney blocked or sealed. If sealed from within, we have deliberate concealment. If from without, accident. I propose we shall find the former." The cab drew up beside a narrow alley where the air smelled faintly of coal oil and boiled cabbage. The lodging-house was a dismal affair. 3 stories, each with 2 rooms, the windows smeared with grime. An elderly landlady, wrapped in a shawl and suspicion, greeted us with the guarded civility reserved for strangers of uncertain purpose. "Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson," my companion announced, presenting his card. "We have reason to believe that one of your tenants, a Mr. Arthur Lemming, the watchmaker, may be in some distress." "Lemming," she repeated, blinking. "He's not been seen these 3 days, sir. Keeps to himself, he does. Paid his rent punctual. I thought maybe he'd gone off to visit kin." "Did he?" By any chance, leave word of travel?" "None, sir, and I've heard no movement from his room. I would have gone in, only he keeps it locked." Holmes's gaze flicked upward to the chimney stack, from which no smoke now issued. "Kindly fetch your key," he said. The landlady hesitated, muttering about privacy and rent, but something in Holmes's quiet authority silenced her protest. She led us up a narrow staircase that groaned beneath our feet. The door to Lemming's room stood at the end of the passage, its brass knob dulled by years of handling. She tried the key. It turned easily, but the door would not yield. "Locked from inside," Holmes murmured. "Watson, your shoulder, if you please." With one firm thrust, the door gave way, releasing a breath of air so heavy and stale that we instinctively stepped back. The curtains were drawn. The single lamp had burned out. On the table lay an assortment of tools, fine instruments of precision, tiny gears, and a half-dismantled watch, frozen mid-repair. The hearth was cold, yet the scent of burned oil hung unmistakably in the air. Holmes approached the fireplace, crouching before it as though studying a crime scene in miniature. "Observe," he whispered. "The grate is clean, too clean. Ashes swept away, yet the iron still bears the warmth of recent heat." He struck a match and held it near the hearth's edge. The flame wavered oddly, pulled not upward but sideways, as if drawn toward a hidden current. Without a word, he knelt lower, reaching beneath the ironwork. There came a faint click, followed by the sound of scraping metal. When he withdrew his hand, it held a small, square panel of soot-stained brick, a false piece concealing a cavity beneath the hearth. Inside lay a folded scrap of parchment and something that glimmered faintly in the matchlight. A tiny gear, blackened at one edge. Holmes lifted it delicately between thumb and forefinger. "A watch part, of course," he said, "but not of ordinary design. Note the alloy. Not brass, not steel. And this, Watson, is why the smoke fell. The fire was not extinguished by chance. It was starved of air, smothered deliberately to hide what burned here." The parchment, when unfolded, revealed a series of sketched diagrams. Mechanical lungs, bellows joined by tubes to a small chamber marked with chemical symbols. Beneath it, in spidery handwriting, "To breathe again, the soul through steam." Holmes stared at the words for a long moment, then rose abruptly, his face set. Mr. Lemming was no ordinary craftsman. He was a visionary, and perhaps a madman. Yet madness seldom kills itself with such neatness. No body, no exit, and yet a sealed room. Curious indeed. The landlady crossed herself. "You mean he's gone?" Holmes replied softly, "but not departed." We searched the room from corner to corner. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no footprints but our own. A single window latched from within overlooked the street, and below it the same chimney that had given forth its strange descending smoke. I leaned out and saw that its opening was clogged with a mesh of fine wire, fused together as if by heat. Holmes examined it closely. "An artificial blockage," he said. "Welded, not accidental. Someone wished to reverse the draft, to send the smoke inward, not outward." "Why in heaven's name would anyone do that?" I asked. "To destroy what must not be seen. A mechanical experiment, perhaps of dangerous nature, or a test gone awry. But note the absence of our watchmaker. If he were burned, there would be remains. If he fled, there would be trace. We have neither. Which leaves us a third possibility, that he was taken and his disappearance masked by the illusion of fire." A soft rap sounded from the hallway. It was a boy of perhaps 10 years, his cap askew, his face smudged with soot. "Beg pardon, sir," he said, eyeing Holmes with a mixture of fear and fascination. "I seen something that night. A man, what came out the back, near midnight, had ears that shone, sir, like copper." Holmes turned sharply. Copper ears, you say? Yes, sir. Gleamed when the lamplight hit 'em. Never seen nothing like it. He moved queerly, too, as if listening to sounds what weren't there. Holmes's gaze deepened, his thoughts already racing down unseen paths. You are an observant lad, he said. What is your name? Tom, sir. Tom Biddle. Very well, Tom Biddle. You have earned a shilling, and my gratitude. Should you recall aught else, present yourself at Baker Street. The boy beamed and vanished into the fog, his footsteps fading down the stairwell. Holmes stood silent for several moments, staring into the empty hearth. Then, almost to himself, he murmured, Copper ears, a mind that breathes through steam, a fire that dies without burning. Watson, we are standing at the mouth of something infernal. As we descended the stairs, the fog outside pressed close against the windows, thicker than before. The landlady shuddered. Will you tell the police, Mr. Holmes? In due course, he said, but not before I understand what manner of fire dies downward. The cab waited where we had left it, the horse stamping impatiently. As we climbed in, I cast one last glance at the lodging house. From its chimney, no smoke now rose nor fell, only a faint, lingering scent of oil in the air, as though the city itself were holding its breath. Holmes said nothing on the journey home. Only when we reached Baker Street did he speak, his voice scarcely above a whisper. Watson, make a note. The direction of smoke is the direction of guilt, and somewhere beneath that chimney, a truth still smoulders. By the following morning, London had buried itself deeper beneath a shroud of fog so thick that even the lamplighters moved with hesitation. The city was a labyrinth of muted sound, hooves clattering like whispers, carriage bells ringing from unseen distances, and the slow dripping of water from eaves into unseen puddles below. Within the comfortable gloom of Baker Street, Holmes sat cross-legged upon the floor beside the hearth, surrounded by an array of instruments and a small wooden box that had been delivered earlier that day. The remnants of our visit to Whitechapel lay before him, the curious gear, the soot-stained parchment, and a pinch of black dust collected from the chimney's grate. He had been silent for an hour, every movement deliberate. I busied myself with the morning paper, though my eyes returned continually to that curious little object he examined under his magnifying glass. At last, he looked up. The alloy, Watson, he said quietly, contains both copper and a trace of antimony. An unusual combination for watchmaking, but ideal for conducting heat while resisting corrosion. Our Mr. Lemming was not repairing timepieces merely. He was forging something meant to endure fire itself. Yet to what end? I asked. You think he built that machine on the parchment, the artificial lungs? Or was forced to, Holmes replied. The sketches bear his hand, but the precision, the balance of mechanics and chemistry, betrays a collaborator, or perhaps a patron. Someone with greater resources than a Whitechapel watchmaker could command. He stood, his gaze distant. Watson, when invention becomes secret, secrecy becomes motive. We must return to that room, but this time, with permission neither sought nor granted. It was late afternoon when we reached the tenement once more. The fog hung so low that even the gas lamps glowed like dull embers, their halos swallowed by the haze. The landlady greeted us with wary resignation, though Holmes's earlier manner had left her no doubt of our intent. "You've not found the gentleman, then?" she asked anxiously. Holmes smiled faintly. "Not yet, but his absence continues to speak most eloquently." The room remained undisturbed since our departure, save for the faint scent of damp and the dull sheen of moisture on the window pane. Holmes set to work at once, examining the walls, the hearth, the floorboards, every surface touched by time or man. It was while tracing the faint line of soot above the mantelpiece that he paused, frowning. "Do you observe, Watson, how the plaster here is slightly discolored, as though by heat?" Yet the hearth itself shows none of it. The warmth rose not from the fire, but from within the wall. He drew his penknife and scraped at the plaster. Beneath it lay a thin sheet of metal, tarnished copper running vertically between the bricks. He tapped it lightly. It rang hollow. "A conduit," he murmured. "But to what purpose?" With careful pressure, he pried the edge loose. The panel lifted to reveal a narrow cavity no wider than a man's arm, and within it, the faint glint of coiled tubing and a small glass cylinder, blackened inside by residue. Holmes extracted it gingerly, wrapping it in his handkerchief. "Burned oil, yes," he whispered, holding it to the light. "But laced with sulfuric trace. Our fire did not burn coal alone. This was a controlled chemical reaction, and one that required both design and knowledge." "You believe someone conducted experiments here?" "Not merely experiments," Holmes said gravely. "A demonstration, and I suspect it was not the first. Do you recall the boy's description? The man with copper ears? That was no fancy. There exists a type of auditory instrument used by engineers to amplify sound in noisy factories. Thin copper shells worn over the ears. If our mysterious visitor bore such devices, he would have heard even the faintest hiss of escaping gas or the ticking of a valve. He came to listen, Watson. To listen to something breathing that should not have been alive." A sudden draught stirred the air, extinguishing the lamp. Holmes's eyes flicked to the window. It was closed, yet a faint vibration trembled through the glass as though from movement in the chimney above. We froze. Then came a dull, hollow clang, once, twice, echoing faintly from somewhere within the flue. Holmes moved swiftly to the hearth, drawing his revolver from beneath his coat. He crouched, listening. "There is someone up there," he said in a whisper. "Or something." Before I could speak, he struck a match and held it toward the dark opening. The flame wavered violently, drawn upward this time as though the blockage had shifted. In that brief flash I thought I saw a gleam, not of eyes, but of metal, before the light guttered out. Then, silence. Holmes's jaw tightened. "He was here all along," he said grimly. "Watching, waiting for us to leave." With a sudden motion, he thrust the poker into the chimney, striking upward with controlled precision. Something metallic clattered and fell, bouncing onto the hearth with a dull ring. It was a circular plate, thin and polished, embossed with an emblem I did not recognize. A serpent coiled about a gear, its fangs piercing the rim. Holmes examined it under the lamplight. "An insignia," he murmured, "and one I have seen before. The mark of a defunct engineering society, the Mechanists' Guild, disbanded after a fatal explosion in Clerkenwell some years ago. Their surviving members vanished into various trades, but one, a certain Elias Croft, was reported to have lost his hearing and much of his face in the blast. Copper ears, Watson. Our listener has a name." He slipped the emblem into his pocket and turned toward the door. "We must find Lestrade. I believe we can offer him something more substantial than conjecture." At Scotland Yard, the inspector received us with his usual mixture of irritation and reluctant respect. "Another one of your infernal theories, eh, Mr. Holmes?" he grumbled, thumbing through the documents Holmes had laid before him. "A missing watchmaker, a sooty chimney, and a man with brass trinkets for heirs. It sounds more like a sideshow than a case." "Then by all means, Lestrade," Holmes said evenly. "Ignore it. You have the Bow Street thefts and the river murders to occupy your time. Only when another house erupts in flames and no culprit is found, remember that smoke may travel faster than warrants." Lestrade sighed, defeated. "All right, then. You've my ear. Copper or not. What do you propose?" "A discreet watch on the docks," Holmes replied. "Lemming's sketches mention compounds imported from the continent, volatile, unstable, and in the wrong hands, catastrophic. Someone intends to transport or test them. If Croft lives, he will not act alone." That night, Holmes scarcely slept. He sat by the window, the fog pressing against the glass like a living thing, the ember of his pipe glowing and fading in rhythm with his thoughts. When dawn came pale and reluctant, he turned to me with a weariness I had seldom seen in him. "There is something monstrous in this design, Watson. A man who seeks to imitate life with steam courts disaster, but one who teaches machines to breathe. That man invites a new form of death. Our vanished watchmaker may yet be both victim and creator of his own undoing." He rose, his silhouette framed by the grey light. "Prepare yourself, my dear fellow. We go to Clerkenwell. Where there are remnants of smoke, there must still be fire." The road to Clerkenwell passed through streets where the fog lay in pockets, pooling low along the gutters and hanging in torn veils from the arches of the railway. By mid-morning, the bells from a nearby church tolled with a muffled softness, as though wrung under a blanket. Holmes walked at a pace that forced my stride, his cane scarcely touching the pavement, his eyes traveling in swift, darting glances over shop fronts and yard gates. There was something of the hunting hound in his bearing that day, head poised, breath even, the mind already at the quarry. He had sent a note to Lestrade before we left Baker Street, naming Clerkenwell as our destination and enclosing a simple request that a constable observe the approaches to the old manufactories by noon. Whether the yard would oblige was another matter. Holmes, who rarely relied upon official charity, did not slacken for it. Clerkenwell itself bore the marks of trades half forgotten. Metal shavings glittered like mica in the seams of the cobbles. A faint, permanent tang of oil lived in the brickwork as surely as damp in a cellar. Shutters leaned on bruised hinges, and here and there a thin plume of breath escaped from a ventilator, sighing as it met the cold. Holmes paused before a narrow alley with a bent iron sign, its letters flaked to ghosts. Crow. And so, engine. The rest had been surrendered to rust. He ran his gloved finger along the doorframe, then lifted it to the light. A dark smear glistened, oil heavy with some grit. He touched it to his tongue with the dainty fastidiousness of a chemist at his bench, and nodded once. "Not cartwheel grease," he murmured. "Valve compound. Recent, and there—" He inclined his head toward the threshold where a scuffed semicircle marred the dust. "The toe of a boot that drags. Our man favors one leg, but not from birth. Weight thrown outward at the last inch. Injury acquired, then compensated. I would wager a left knee that stiffens in the cold." "You mean Croft?" "If names follow nature, yes." He set his shoulder to the door. It yielded with a moan that seemed more complaint than resistance, and we stepped into a workshop which felt at first like the hold of a ship abandoned at sea. The dim light gathered in puddles on brass and glass. Rows of lathes and vices stood motionless in prayer. 1,000 small mouths, the chucks of drills, the throats of bellows, gaped in mute surprise at our intrusion. Somewhere in the far corner, a slow, irregular drip ticked time into a pan. Holmes removed his hat and advanced with care, as one does in a sick room where a patient clings to sleep. It was the sound that found us, not the drip nor the distant cart outside, but a faint, persistent susurration buried beneath the silence. A breath where there should be none. Holmes lifted his hand, and we both listened. It rose and fell so softly that at first I thought it a trick of my own lungs reflected back to me by the hush of the place. Then it separated itself, taking on a rhythm of its own, a barely audible inhalation followed by a stilled pause, then the ghost of an exhalation that seemed to travel through metal. "Do you hear it?" he whispered. "Like air in a reed," I said. He moved toward it, weaving between hulks of machines, until we found a narrow door whose edges had been sealed with pitch. He touched the pitch with a fingertip. It came away pliant. "Fresh," he murmured, and set his blade to it. The door sighed open, and with it the breathing grew, though not in volume. It grew in intention. I felt absurdly that something on the other side had been listening for us, and now, aware, altered its rhythm to meet ours. The little room was windowless and close. Upon a bench lay the carcass of a device I recognized from Lemming's sketches. Twin bellows of kid leather bracketed to a piston, lengths of tubing drawn together by brass collars, a small cylinder capped with a valve cunningly designed to flutter at the lightest pressure. The leather had been oiled and mended by a careful hand. The valve's edge bore the tongue marks of fine pliers. Beside it lay a coil of wire mesh and a pair of shells hammered in the rough shape of human ears, their interiors dulled with a woolly padding. Holmes took up one of the copper shells and turned it in his palm, and for a moment I had the disquieting sense of holding a part of a man, like a relic kept behind glass. He set it down as one sets down something sacred or obscene, I could not tell which, and bent over the contrivance, his fingers traveling the lines of it as a musician finds a melody he has known for years. Lemming's heart, he said, and Croft's lungs. See how the bellows are yoked, so that one draws while the other drives. The breath enters here, passes the valve, and returns there. It was not meant to revive the dead, Watson. It was meant to imitate the living, regular enough to deceive the eye and the ear. A decoy. A mask, he said, for smoke, for vapor, for something that must not be seen moving of its own accord. This breath would hide another. I stared at the lifeless bellows and felt, for the first time in that case, a heaviness in the pit of my stomach that had nothing to do with fear. There is a point at which ingenuity begins to resemble cruelty too closely to be admired. Holmes must have read something of this in my face, for his own softened. "Do not mistake the instrument for the crime," he said gently. "It is the hand that plays it which we must find." We searched the bench and the shelves above it. Among jars of screws and springs, Holmes uncovered a ledger bound in cracked calf. The pages were a soldier's parade of numbers, dates, and parts, until the last leaves, where the handwriting altered, tighter, impatient, as if the pen had been clenched too hard. Names appeared in that changed script. One I knew at a glance, Arthur Lemming. Another, written with a tremor as though the ink itself hesitated to attach the letters, E. Croft. The entries grew sparse, then stopped altogether, leaving a streak of ink like the falter of a pulse. Payments received. None, Holmes murmured. Payments demanded. Urgent. And here, the mark again. He tapped the margin where the serpent and gear had been sketched with a draftsman's exactitude. He returned to the emblem, if not the society. Footfalls scuffed the floor outside. They were not stealthy, rather the sound one makes when entering a room one has a right to, without thought for disturbance. Holmes closed the ledger and slipped it under his coat in the same motion with which he turned to face the door. A figure filled the frame, a man of medium height, wrapped in a heavy coat whose collar rose to his cheeks, a cap pulled low, a scarf wound close. What drew the eye were neither the clothes nor the posture, but the metal that cupped his ears. Twin scallops of copper, darkened by hand and weather, their rims meeting the cap's edge. Under the brim, the skin of the temples bore scars like white rivers cut through old clay. The man halted. The breath in the little room ceased, as though the bellows themselves had frozen at the sight of him. "Mr. Croft, I believe," said Holmes with a courtesy that would have suited a drawing-room. The man did not answer, his gaze fixed on the bench behind us, then on our hands, then on Holmes's coat, from which, despite all his quickness, a corner of calfskin protruded. He lifted one gloved finger and pointed to it. When he spoke, the voice was rough and oddly placed in the head, the tone of a man who hears himself imperfectly. "That does not belong to you." Holmes inclined his head. "Nor, I suspect, to any living bookseller. Be easy, Mr. Croft. We have handled your work with respect." A flicker crossed the man's face. Pride, wounded or awakened, I could not tell. He stepped into the room and shut the door behind him. The copper shells caught the dim light and gave it back with the sheen of old pennies. Up close, I saw the workmanship. The edges had been rolled and soldered, the padding stitched with admirable neatness. Whether they were instruments or armor, I did not yet know. "If you have come with the yard," he said, "say so now, and we'll finish quickly." "We have not," Holmes replied. "Inspector Lestrade is advised to keep his distance, at least until a thing is understood that, mishandled, might kill half a street. I speak of vapors and fire, of lungs made of leather, of men whose names have burned and not been burned. I speak, Mr. Croft, of Arthur Lemming." Some change took place in the set of Croft's shoulders. It was not the slump of guilt, nor the stiffening of denial, but a narrow inward turn, as if a door had been slammed within him. He moved past us and stood over the bench. His gloved hands hovered over the bellows, not touching. When he did touch them, it was with the back of the knuckles, gently, as one greets a sleeping child. "He drew too much," he said. "Always he drew too much. The lines were perfect and the world was a ruin behind the lines. He thought breath was breath, and I told him no. Breath is weight and heat and time. He wanted a miracle. He bought danger." "From whom?" asked Holmes. Croft's eyes slid to the coil of mesh. "There are men who trade in what the law does not name because the law does not know how. They call it oil, but it is not oil. They call it spirit, but it is not spirit. It is the ghost of fire that has not yet been born. He paid for it with the last of his rent and with the last of his patience, and when it came, I told him to wait for me. He did not wait." "You arrived at the tenement," I said, "the night the landlady last saw him." He looked up sharply, the copper catching a tremor in the air and ringing the faintest chime. I heard the draft wrong. The chimney had been given teeth. He sealed the room, thinking to keep the breath inside until I came, but the breath had its own will. It bit him. The gloved hand tightened. There are burns that leave nothing but the shape of a man in the ash. There are also burns that take nothing but the name. Holmes's voice was very soft. "Did you see him, Mr. Croft? In what state?" Croft shook his head once. "I saw the room through the grate. I heard the bellows tearing themselves to pieces. I took what I could and I left what was not mine." He gestured with a single small movement to the ledger beneath Holmes's coat, as if acknowledging a debt paid badly. "Why the emblem in the chimney?" Holmes asked. "Why the gilt serpent?" "So that those who still remember would know that this was not an accident," Croft said. "So that they would know a warning when they saw smoke fall." He drew the scarf lower, and I glimpsed the ruin the blast had left years ago, a mouth drawn strange by healed fire, a cheek that refused to mirror its twin. "You will tell your yardman that if he comes blundering in with his lamps and his curious noses, the air in these walls will complain, and when the air complains, the river hears it. And when the river hears it, she carries the complaint to the ships." "You speak like a man who has already heard the river's answer," Holmes replied. "Is there to be a demonstration?" "There was to be," Croft said. "Now there is only the emptiness that follows when a man keeps his promise too late." Holmes studied him with the concentration he gives to those rare souls who stand somewhere between villain and victim and may at any moment be either. "You called the substance the ghost of fire," he said. "Who sold it?" Croft's gaze flicked to me, then to the door as if sound traveled under it. When he spoke, it was with care. "There is a warehouse on the river's bend where rope was once spun and now other threads are wound. Ask for a man called Meeks. He will not know his own name until you show him coin. But if you ask the wrong question, he will remember he has friends upon the continent who pay better than any doctor or detective." He took up the copper shells and settled them anew against his skull. "Go lightly, Mr. Holmes. The breath you seek to follow does not come from a man. It comes from a design that has learned to breathe without him." He moved to pass us. Holmes raised a hand, not in threat, but in appeal. One last question. Did you love him? Croft paused. He neither turned nor flinched. He simply lowered his head, and for the first time the copper did not ring but doled, as if the air itself had taken off its boots to walk more softly past his grief. "I loved the work more than the man until the work killed the man," he said at last. "That is the curse of our trade." He stepped out into the workshop and was gone into the fog beyond the door, absorbed without footfall, without the lightest scrape of leather on wood. Only the drip into the pan remained, and the bellows on the bench that no longer breathed. Holmes stood for a moment looking at the place Croft had left empty. Then he set the ledger upon the bench, opened it to the entries that named both men, and with the nail of his thumb scored a tiny cross in the margin beside the last date. "The river," he said. "The rope house on the bend." He closed the book and breathed out, as if to steady the measure of the day. "Before the yard arrives with its clatter, we shall pay a call where the city whispers louder than it shouts." As we stepped back into the street, the fog rose up with sudden eagerness, and the bells of Clerkenwell found us again, counting an hour we did not agree to spend. I felt the curious pull one feels when the path ahead is chosen without one's consent, as if the day itself had turned its face to the river and would not be gainsaid. Holmes hailed a cab with a lift of his stick, and as we climbed in, he glanced once back at the black mouth of the workshop, then forward to the invisible curve of the Thames, and I knew that whatever waited in that rope house would require more than observation and more than courage. It would require, perhaps, a new understanding of how death travels, quietly, with its own breath. The fog that evening had thickened into a kind of silence. Even the cries of the newsboys along Fleet Street seemed muffled, their calls swallowed by the smog that rolled off the Thames like breath from a great sleeping beast. Holmes and I moved through that damp world with the surety of men long accustomed to its tricks, turning down alleys whose cobbles gleamed like wet iron, passing doorways from which the smell of soot and gin mingled like a melancholy perfume. Holmes had spoken little since our meeting with Croft, but his silence was the kind that hums with thought. His eyes, sharp as ever, flicked ceaselessly over the shop, signs and shuttered warehouses, reading some hidden text in their decay that escaped ordinary sight. We reached the end of a narrow lane where an old ironworks slumped beneath a soot-caked sign, Lemming and Croft, Clockmakers, 1872. The letters were half-eaten by rust, the paint beneath them blistered from long neglect. It was there, beneath those forgotten words, that Holmes stopped. "Watson," he murmured, "do you notice how the fog behaves here?" I looked about. The air was indeed moving oddly, curling in lazy spirals rather than drifting freely with the wind. "It's thicker," I said, "almost as though it gathers to this spot." "Precisely," Holmes whispered. "Heat rises from below. Someone or something keeps fire within this ruin." He pressed a hand to the door, then withdrew it at once. "Warm," he said softly. "We are not alone." The lock gave way under his slender blade with barely a sigh. Inside, the gloom was complete, broken only by a faint glimmer from a half-covered lantern that hung at the far end of the room. Dust drifted through the air like drowned motes of gold. Everywhere there were fragments of machinery, gears, pulleys, clock hands, the skeletal remains of larger devices whose purposes I could not guess. The floorboards creaked beneath our boots like timbers of a ship adrift, and then I heard it, the faintest murmur, a sound so low that at first I thought it no more than wind. Yet it carried a pattern, an almost human cadence, as though voices whispered just beyond hearing. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Holmes raised a hand for silence. His head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowing in that familiar look of complete absorption. "Not voices," he said at last. "Air, machinery. There is something alive in these walls." We advanced, step by step, until we came upon a row of brass tubes that ran along the length of the workshop. Each was capped with a small funnel-shaped opening, and from within came the soft pulse of air. steady, rhythmic, almost like breathing. Holmes bent to examine one. The faint whisper that escaped it seemed to carry an echo of words, but distorted, as though shaped by the hiss of steam rather than by tongue or lip. He turned to me, his face illuminated in flashes by the lantern's trembling flame. "Watson, we are standing inside an acoustic device, a vast speaking instrument or the remains of one. These tubes once carried sound, perhaps the voice of a single man amplified through the entire workshop. Like the pipes of an organ?" "Precisely," Holmes said. "Only this instrument seems tuned to speech rather than to music. Imagine a man's whisper carried through a labyrinth of metal until it could be heard by others miles away, or mistaken for a ghost by those who could not see the speaker. Ingenious, but perilous. A voice that travels without a face becomes a weapon in the wrong hands." He moved toward the workbench at the far end. There, amid a confusion of sketches, was a rough blueprint drawn in Lemming's delicate script, an elaborate network of bellows and tubes, not unlike the mechanical lungs we had seen before, but vastly larger in scale. A notation at the corner read, "Phase 2, resonant chamber beneath the tower." Holmes traced the words with his finger. "So," he said softly, "our watchmaker dreamed not merely of breath, but of speech. He sought to give his creation a voice." "And Croft?" I asked. Holmes straightened. "Croft may have feared what he helped to build, hence his warning about the river, the vapor, and the air that complains. I suspect Lemming completed this phase in secret, and perhaps tested it here. Tell me, Watson, do you recall that telegram from Prague?" I nodded. "The one with the foreign numerals?" "Indeed. I believe now it was not a mere cipher. It was a set of frequencies, musical notes transcribed as numbers. Instructions for tuning this infernal contraption. The experiment succeeded, I think, but the price was fatal." A faint metallic thump echoed from somewhere beneath the floor, followed by the slow wheeze of a valve opening. The air thickened with the unmistakable scent of burned oil. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "He still breathes," he whispered. Before I could reply, a gust of hot air burst from one of the brass funnels. It carried a sound, a rasping exhalation that seemed to shape itself into a word. "Holmes." My blood froze. Holmes did not move. His face had grown pale, the fine lines of concentration tightening around his mouth. "Not possible," he murmured. "Yet, listen." Again the voice came, hollow and distorted. "You should not have come." I confess, in that moment I felt the old instinctive dread that no science can entirely banish, the sense of something unnatural speaking through human means. Holmes, however, stepped closer to the tube, his expression one of fierce curiosity. "Watson," he said quietly, "strike the lantern higher. The sound is vented by vibration, not magic." He placed his hand upon the brass and closed his eyes. "Ah," he murmured. "Yes, there is motion. Regular, mechanical. Someone below operates a bellows. This is no ghost. It is an engine of deception." He drew his revolver, gestured for me to follow, and together we descended the narrow staircase at the back of the room. The steps led to a sub-cellar lit only by the dull glow of coals within a furnace. Beside it sat a man bent over a valve wheel, his face obscured by soot and shadow. When he turned, I saw the familiar ruin of features half hidden beneath a copper plate. Croft. "Stand back, Mr. Holmes," he croaked. "The air is poisoned. One spark, and it will end us all." Holmes halted mid-step. "You returned," he said. "Why?" "To finish what he began," Croft answered. "Not for glory, not for gold, for silence. The machine speaks still. It should not. It remembers his voice." Holmes's eyes flashed. "You mean Lemming's?" Croft nodded once. He recorded his final breath into the chamber. It loops eternally, fed by the same oil that killed him. I came to end it, to shut the lungs, stop the breath, but the pressure won't fall. It's alive in its own right now, and I cannot kill what does not die." The machinery hissed louder, as though aware of our intrusion. The pipes rattled overhead. The furnace pulsed with uneven rhythm. Holmes moved closer, examining the valve. "If we cut the flow here," he said, "the cycle will collapse." "No," Croft cried. "It will burst. The vapor has nowhere to go but through the flues. It will climb to the street." Holmes hesitated only a heartbeat. "Then better the street than London's heart," he said, and seized the wheel. The sound that followed defies memory. A roar rose from beneath the floor, swelling into a howl like a dying animal. Steam burst from the walls in ghostly ribbons. The brass tubes above screamed with 100 overlapping voices, each repeating the same fragmented phrase, "To breathe again, to breathe again." Then, as suddenly as it began, silence descended. Croft staggered to his knees, coughing violently. Holmes helped him to his feet. "It's done," he said. "The machine sleeps." Croft looked up at him with eyes hollow as smelter's slag. "You don't understand, Mr. Holmes," he whispered. "Machines don't sleep. They dream." At that, he tore free of Holmes's grasp and fled up the stairs, disappearing into the night. Holmes and I remained amid the settling steam, the faint tick of cooling metal echoing around us like the heartbeat of something not quite dead. When we emerged onto the street, the fog had thinned, yet the air carried a strange scent. Sweet, metallic, and faintly acrid. Holmes stood for a long while, staring back at the shuttered workshop. "Watson," he said at last, "have you ever considered that invention may one day replace imagination? That men will make ghosts of their own devising?" He turned, his eyes reflecting the lamplight like twin sparks. Lemming built a voice that would not cease. "Let us hope it is not the first of its kind." We hailed a cab toward Baker Street, the wheels splashing through puddles that mirrored the pale gleam of the moon. Behind us, deep within Clerkenwell's bowels, I fancied I heard one last sigh, soft, uncertain, almost human, fade into the fog. For several days after the events in Clerkenwell, Holmes moved about our rooms like a man haunted not by what he had seen, but by what he had failed to name. He played his violin at odd hours, sometimes violently, sometimes with such delicate melancholy that it seemed an apology whispered to no one. I, too, found myself uneasy. The vision of that vast, whispering contraption breathing in darkness had imprinted itself upon my mind, and I could not shake the feeling that we had silenced something not merely mechanical, but sentient. A thought too absurd for reason, yet one that clung to the imagination like soot on a sleeve. One bleak morning, the matter was forced again to our attention. The postman brought a single telegram, its envelope damp from fog and sealed with an unfamiliar red wax bearing the faint impression of a foreign crest. A lion, rampant, clutching a gear. Holmes tore it open, his eyes scanning the page swiftly. For the first time in days, a spark of true animation crossed his face. "Watson," he said, "the continent has awakened. The ashes of Clerkenwell have traveled faster than steam." He handed me the paper. It bore a short message in clipped formal English. "Machine identified. Origin, Prague. Sender, Karel Vondracek. Immediate discussion imperative. 2 lives already lost. Will arrive London on the 10th. Guard your air." There was no address for reply. "Prague," I said. "The workshop of Europe, where they build things that think faster than men." Holmes's eyes had narrowed. "Vondracek," he murmured, "a metallurgist of peculiar genius, expelled from the Imperial Polytechnic for experiments that blurred the line between chemistry and consciousness. His name appeared in dispatches some years ago concerning an affair in Vienna, a factory explosion and a vanished prototype known only as the Prometheus engine." I stared at him. "So, you mean to suggest Lemming's design was part of that?" Holmes struck a match and lit his pipe. I suggest only that the breath which animated Lemming's contrivance was not his own invention. It was imported, perhaps illicitly, perhaps unwittingly. Von Dracek's warning implies a chain of deaths. Lemming may be but one link in that grim sequence. We spoke no more until the following morning, when Lestrade arrived at our door, soaked to the bone and smelling of damp wool and frustration. "Another of your damnable coincidences, Mr. Holmes," he began, tossing a folded newspaper onto the table. "Explosion on the Thames last night. Warehouse fire near Limehouse. 3 men dead. No bodies found, mind you, just ash and scorched iron. Scotland Yard's baffled, so naturally I thought of you." Holmes scanned the article. "The river's bend," he murmured, half to himself. "Croft's warning fulfilled." Lestrade frowned. "You know something of this?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Only that London breathes a little heavier this morning." Lestrade scowled, but left soon after, muttering about theatrical riddles. The moment the door closed, Holmes sprang to his feet. "Watson, our friend Croft's prophecy was exact. The air complained and the river heard. We must trace that complaint to its source before the 10th, before Von Dracek arrives to find us choking on our own curiosity." We set out at once for Limehouse. The fog there was a different breed, thicker, dirtier, perfumed with the faint sweetness of tar and decay. The remnants of the warehouse stood black against the pale water, its roof collapsed, its walls still steaming faintly from within. A group of constables guarded the site, but Holmes's card gained us entry with minimal protest. Inside, the stench was overpowering, a mingling of burnt oil, wet rope, and something far less ordinary, a scent that made the back of my throat tighten. Holmes bent to a pool of dark residue near a broken crate, dipping the tip of his glove into it. "Not oil," he said quietly. "Nor tar. Watson, smell." I obeyed reluctantly. The odor was unlike anything familiar, sharp, metallic, yet oddly organic, like blood touched by acid. "It is as I feared," Holmes continued. "The same compound used in Lemming's workshop. The ghost of fire, as Croft called it. And here, see these impressions?" He pointed to a set of faint circular marks scorched into the floorboards. Bellows or cylinders. Small, portable. The design has traveled. Among the wreckage, Holmes discovered a scrap of torn parchment, half-burned, yet legible enough to read a few words in German. Versuch 2. Bewusstsein. Atembehalten. Experiment 2. Consciousness. Retain the breath. He folded it carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "Von Dracek's hand," he murmured. "He pursues his machine as one might pursue a lost child." As we left the ruins, the fog began to rise, lifting in tattered veils that exposed the river beyond. A tugboat drifted past, its whistle keening through the haze like a dirge. Holmes stopped abruptly, his eyes fixed upon the opposite bank. "There," he said, pointing to a small jetty half obscured by reeds. "A man observing us." I turned, but saw only a silhouette, tall, thin, motionless. The instant Holmes took a step forward, the figure vanished into the mist. "Croft?" I whispered. "Or someone sent to ensure his silence," Holmes replied grimly. "Either way, this affair extends beyond London's fog and into the factories of Europe. The air grows crowded with unseen minds." We returned home in uneasy quiet. That evening, as I prepared my notes, Holmes sat by the fire, turning the Prague telegram over and over in his hands. At length he said, "Watson, you have often remarked that my interest in human emotion is limited. Yet I confess to feeling something akin to dread this night, not for myself, but for the city. If a man can teach iron to breathe, another can teach it to hate." At that moment there came a knock. Mrs. Hudson entered with a second telegram. Holmes tore it open, read swiftly, and exhaled through his nose. "From Lestrade," he said. "A body has washed up near Blackfriars Bridge. burned beyond recognition but wearing fragments of copper at the ears. Croft. Holmes's jaw tightened. He rose, his shadow thrown tall upon the wallpaper. The man who warned us has drowned in the warning. They are closing the circle, Watson, and we have less than 2 days before Vondracek arrives with whatever truth remains. That night, sleep evaded me. I heard Holmes pacing long after midnight, his steps quick, restless, the sound of a mind working faster than the body could bear. The next morning, as dawn crept over the chimneys, he stood at the window, motionless save for the faint motion of his pipe. "Watson," he said, "have you ever considered that a telegram may serve not only as a message, but as trap?" He held up the Prague dispatch, its edges faintly discolored. "See the stain along the fold? Invisible ink, chemical residue. I detected the odor last night. It is a reagent used to carry micro-etchings within paper fibers. Under heat, it reveals miniature inscriptions." He held it over the lamp, and faint lines began to emerge. Not words, but a sequence of numbers and sigils. "Coordinates," he murmured. "Not for Prague, for London." "Where?" I asked. "The catacombs beneath St. Jude's Cathedral," he said. "And unless I misjudge, that is where the next breath will rise." He crushed the telegram into his pocket, his eyes alight once more with that fierce and terrible certainty that always preceded revelation. "Come, Watson. The ghosts of men may whisper through metal, but even ghosts must keep their appointments." The morning that carried us to St. Jude's was a pale and colorless thing, a ghost of sunlight diluted by smoke. The cathedral's great spire rose from the heart of Clerkenwell like a spear forgotten by giants, its stones darkened by a century of soot, and its bells silent under a winter sky. As we approached, the air felt heavy with something older than weather, an unease that clung to the skin as though the very stones of London had drawn breath to listen. Holmes strode ahead through the thin mist curling around the railings of the churchyard. "You perceive, Watson," he said quietly, "that this place stands at the confluence of 2 trades, the spiritual and the industrial. Half its parish lives by prayer, the other by steam. When those 2 vapors meet, the result is rarely wholesome." The great doors yielded to our push with a sound that might have been mistaken for a sigh. Inside, the nave was dim, the air touched with incense and cold iron. A few candles flickered before the altar, their flames bowing to invisible draughts. Somewhere unseen, a single organ pipe exhaled a faint tremor of wind, as if the instrument itself breathed in uneasy sleep. We had not advanced far when a voice rose from the gloom above the chancel, calm, resonant, and unmistakably foreign. "Mr. Holmes of Baker Street," it said. "I wondered when you would arrive." From the shadows emerged a tall man in a cassock of faded black, his hair silvered at the temples, his expression serene to the point of severity. He descended the narrow stair from the organ loft with a composure that bespoke either innocence or the most perfect guilt. "I am Anton Krejcik," he said with a bow. "Precentor here. Once I was also choir master at the Church of St. Nicholas in Prague." Holmes inclined his head. "Then you are colleague, or successor, to one Karel Vondracek." A brief flicker of amusement crossed the precentor's features. "Colleague, yes. Successor, never. Vondracek built engines. I build harmony, yet even harmony can burn when too many notes sound at once." His accent turned the words to music. I confess, there was something mesmerizing about his voice, rich, controlled, a cadence that could persuade a congregation into stillness or a mob into peace. Holmes seemed to note it too. "You have a gift for resonance, Mr. Krejcik," he said. "Does it extend to the tuning of metal as well as men?" The precentor's smile did not falter. "Sound is sound, Mr. Holmes, whether drawn from string, pipe, or piston." He gestured toward the towering instrument behind him. Its brass pipes climbed like organ stops into the half-light, but the array was strange. Between the customary ranks of tin and wood were thicker cylinders of polished copper, joined by valves and small wheels more suited to a factory than a church. Holmes approached it slowly, his fingers trailing along one of the tubes. "Extra ranks," he murmured. "Added recently, and fed not by bellows, but by compressed air. Ingenious." "Blasphemous, some would say," Krejcik replied softly. "Yet the Almighty speaks in many tongues, some of them mechanical." He moved to the console, resting his hands on the keys. "This instrument," he said, "was my answer to Vondracek's engine, a way to give the divine breath shape, to redeem the sin of imitation, but others sought less holy music." He pressed a single key. A low note rolled through the cathedral, so deep I felt it more than heard it. Dust drifted from the rafters. Another key, and another. Each tone seemed to tremble with a life of its own, vibrating the air like the slow heartbeat of a giant. Holmes watched intently. "And who were these others, Mr. Krejcik? The men who persuaded a London watchmaker to die for an experiment?" The organist's hands hovered motionless above the keys. "Men who believe creation is theft," he said, "who build their Babels from brass. When I left Prague, they followed. I told them I had buried the formula beneath these stones. It seems they wished to see whether I spoke truth." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And did you?" Krejcik's eyes lifted toward the vaulted ceiling. "Would you like to find out?" Before I could speak, he struck a sequence of chords that crashed through the nave like thunder. The floor itself seemed to quiver. Beneath our feet came a dull, rolling echo, as though the cathedral concealed some vast cavity alive with returning sound. The final note ended in a faint metallic whine, unmistakably mechanical. Holmes turned on him at once. "You are using the crypt as a resonance chamber," he said. "Beneath this church lies the same design that burned in Clerkenwell." "Not the same," Krejcik corrected gently. "Perfected." He drew back the sleeve of his cassock to reveal a small lever hidden among the stops. "When the faithful sing, the voice of God answers from below. Do you not hear it?" Indeed, there came a murmur from under the flagstones, a deep, rhythmic inhalation like the sea echoing in a shell. My skin prickled. Holmes moved swiftly toward the altar, his expression now one of genuine alarm. "You have reawakened it," he said. "The engine breathes still. If you have linked it to the organ pipes, every note feeds its hunger." Krejcik's eyes glowed with a terrible serenity. "Perhaps that is the point, Mr. Holmes. Perhaps we were meant to hear what breathes in the silence between notes." Holmes seized the lever and wrenched it down. The organ screamed, a hideous metallic shriek that shattered the stillness. From beneath the tiles came the rush of steam and a crack like splitting stone. A jet of pale vapor burst from the floor, carrying with it the smell of scorched oil. Krejcik staggered backward, coughing. "Run!" Holmes shouted, dragging me toward the side door. We burst into the cloister as the first bell above the tower tolled, its mighty bronze throat shuddering under invisible pressure. The sound warped, deepened, then became a roar. A moment later, a gout of steam exploded from the tower louvres, wreathing the spire in white. Holmes pushed me behind a buttress as masonry rained down. The blast subsided almost as swiftly as it had come. When we dared look again, the tower still stood, but a thin ribbon of vapor continued to coil from its vents, whispering like breath drawn through clenched teeth. Inside, we found Krejcik kneeling amid shattered keys and twisted pipes. His face was blackened, his cassock scorched at the sleeves. Holmes bent beside him. "The pressure is vented," he said. "You live by inches, sir. The question is whether you meant to." Krejcik smiled faintly. "To silence it, Mr. Holmes. It had begun to sing on its own. You have done what I could not." Holmes studied him for a moment, then rose, his tone almost gentle. "There will be inquiries, of course. Lestrade will want your statement." "There will be nothing to tell," the organist murmured. By tomorrow, they will say it was gas in the tower, a fault in the furnace, a freak of the season, and they will be right. He looked up at Holmes, his eyes hollow. Tell Vondracek, when he arrives, that his child is dead. He sank into silence. We left him there, surrounded by the wreck of his sacred machine. Outside, the sky had darkened to the color of pewter. Holmes stood a long while on the steps, his hat in his hand, staring at the faint plume rising from the belfry. It seems, he said slowly, that each of these men sought to bottle the breath of life and found instead the breath of death. The line between the two grows ever thinner. We turned toward the street. Behind us, the bell gave one last hollow note and was still. Where now? I asked. Back to Baker Street, he said. There is more yet to come. Vondracek is not here to mourn. He is here to finish the experiment. As we descended into the fog, the faint hiss from the tower followed us like a whispering echo, a reminder that in the depths beneath St. Jude's, something had only paused its breathing, not ceased it. That night, the air over London felt as though it had absorbed every whisper uttered within its walls. The fog no longer drifted. It lingered, unmoving, like the memory of smoke. From the window of our sitting room, I watched the faint glow of the gas lamps dissolve into nothingness a few feet from the glass. Holmes had not spoken since our return from St. Jude's. He sat motionless in his chair before the fire, the light of it flickering across his pale, angular face, throwing sharp shadows beneath his cheekbones. His violin rested on the table beside him, untouched. Mrs. Hudson, sensing the gravity of the night, had retired without her customary bustle. Even the clock seemed reluctant to announce the passing of time, its tick subdued as though fearful of disturbing the thoughts that filled the room. I'd seen my friend in many moods, restless, elated, withdrawn, but never quite as I saw him then, still, yet not tranquil, silent, yet listening. At last he spoke, very quietly. Watson, he said, have you ever considered how much of a man's life remains unrecorded, even to those who think they know him best? I set down my pen. I've written more of your adventures than you would tolerate, Holmes, and fewer than you deserve. But I confess I've often wondered what cases you have left untold. He smiled faintly. There are some that resist the telling. They burn through the paper faster than the ink can dry. He leaned forward and stirred the coals with the poker. And yet even ashes leave a mark. For a time, the only sound was the hiss of the fire. Then Holmes reached into the grate with the tongs and drew out a small fragment of half-burned paper. I found this, he said, when we returned. It was tucked beneath the hearthstones. I did not place it there. He handed it to me. The scrap was charred at the edges, the writing faint but legible. Cannot destroy what breathes without lungs, followed by a single initial V. Vondracek, I said. Or a clever forger, Holmes replied. Yet the handwriting matches the marginal notes from the sketches we took at Clerkenwell. He has been in London longer than his telegram suggests. He rose abruptly and paced to the window. He hides in plain sight, Watson. The perfect disguise for a foreign scientist is that of a British ghost. The next day confirmed his suspicion. A report in the morning edition of the Times described a foreign gentleman of distinguished bearing who'd been seen entering the precincts of St. Jude's shortly before dawn. The verger, questioned later, insisted that the man had not emerged again. Another visitor to the dead, Holmes murmured. He has gone to view his failure, or to reclaim it. He sent a telegram to Lestrade requesting discreet surveillance around the cathedral, though I suspected it would do little good. Holmes's mind, once set in motion, rarely depended on others to reach its conclusion. By afternoon, he had withdrawn entirely into himself. He smoked incessantly, the room thick with the pungent fog of his shag tobacco, until it seemed that Baker Street itself was becoming an extension of the city's breathing. At dusk, he broke his silence. There is something you must see, he said, and led me to his writing desk. Upon it lay an envelope addressed in his own hand but unsealed. The paper was of a heavy cream stock, the ink slightly smeared, as if the words had been written in haste. "It is my confession," he said simply. "Or perhaps my apology." I stared at him, startled. "Good heavens, Holmes, what are you saying?" "Do not misunderstand me, Watson. It is not contrition I write, but clarity. There are truths that should survive me, though not in print. This letter, when complete, is to be consigned to flame. Only its smoke will carry the knowledge of what has passed between men who sought to give breath to machines." He returned to his seat, his gaze lost in the fire. "The case of the dying Chimney is no longer a case. It is an illness, a contagion of thought. One mind infects another with the desire to create, until the act of imitation becomes indistinguishable from worship." He leaned back, closing his eyes. "Tell me, Watson, what separates invention from resurrection? Both begin with the same impulse, to restore what time has taken." I hesitated. Faith, perhaps, or humility. Holmes smiled faintly. "Two virtues I have never possessed." The hours passed in silence. I drifted into a light doze in my chair. When I awoke, the lamp had burned low and the fire had sunk to embers. Holmes still sat motionless, staring into the ashes. But the letter was gone. On the hearth, where it had lain, there remained only a curl of smoke and a single corner unconsumed, upon which I could just discern the words, "If I fall silent, remember the sound of the breath." The following morning brought grim confirmation of our fears. Lestrade arrived in a state of agitation, his hat askew, his face the color of old parchment. "He's gone," he said without preamble. "The Czech fellow, Vondracek. Dead as Julius Caesar." Holmes's eyes flashed open. "Where?" "In the Thames, near the same blasted warehouse. The tide brought him in at dawn." Holmes rose, every line of his body alert. "Describe the condition." Lestrade hesitated. "Strange. That's what it is. No wounds, no water in the lungs, just—" He shuddered, burned from the inside, like a lamp that's gone out. Holmes said nothing. He merely reached for his coat and hat. "Watson, bring your revolver." We followed Lestrade to the morgue. The sight that greeted us was grotesque in its serenity. The man upon the slab, tall, gaunt, with the fine bones of an intellectual, might have been sleeping were it not for the faint shimmer upon his skin, as though it had been lacquered with oil. Around the mouth were traces of soot, and in the nostrils a residue of black dust. Holmes examined the body minutely, his hands steady though his expression betrayed an inward chill. At length he said, "It is not combustion, Lestrade. It is inhalation, the same vapor we found in Clerkenwell, but drawn inward, concentrated." He breathed his own invention. Lestrade swore under his breath. "You mean suicide?" Holmes shook his head. "I mean culmination." He stepped back, his gaze distant. "The telegram was not a warning, Watson. It was an invitation. Guard your air." He meant not danger to us, but to himself. He carried the device within his body, perhaps a small capsule, a portable version of his own machine. When activated, it released the compound, converting breath into flame without heat, pure oxidation, the perfect silent death. I felt a chill that no coat could dispel. "And the letter you burned?" Holmes met my eyes. "Not I, Watson. He." We returned to Baker Street as dusk fell once more. The city outside murmured and breathed, each chimney exhaling its ghostly smoke. Holmes sat again before the hearth, gazing into the faint blue flame that trembled among the coals. "Watson," he said softly, "every man believes he controls the fire he kindles. But fire has no master, only moments of obedience." He reached forward, stirred the embers, and for an instant a tongue of flame leapt up, curling downward like the smoke of that first chimney, the dying breath that had begun it all. In that moment I understood that the case had not ended. only turned inward, retreating into the quiet places of my friend's mind. Something had changed in him, subtly, irreversibly, as though a small part of that forbidden breath had found refuge in his own lungs. The next morning dawned grey and soundless, as though the city itself had grown weary of breath. The newspapers were curiously restrained, 2 columns on the explosion at St. Jude's, one on the mysterious death of a foreign engineer, and then, as if exhausted, the usual notices of Parliament, theatre, and sport. Nothing of what truly moved beneath London's crust appeared in print. Holmes read each line without expression, then folded the paper and laid it aside. "We have entered the quiet phase," he said. "That interval in which the world convinces itself that nothing happened because it cannot endure the notion that something did." He looked out the window. "Sir, and yet the fog carries a different scent today. Do you detect it?" I sniffed the air and caught only the faint bitterness of coal smoke. "No more than usual." "Precisely," said Holmes. "It is absence itself. The air tastes empty. I think we should pay a visit to the place that now gives London its silence, the warehouse on the river." By the time we reached Limehouse, the fog had begun to drift in slow veils, like torn silk. The wharves lay deserted, save for a few rivermen patching their nets, and a constable who saluted Holmes with a mixture of relief and awe. "They told us not to go inside, sir," he said. "The smell's queer, and everything rusts the moment you touch it." "Rusts," Holmes repeated. "Interesting." Within, the air was heavy, but not foul. It felt thick upon the skin, as though charged with invisible weight. The walls bore the bloom of fresh corrosion, copper gone green in a single night. The floorboards, once blackened by flame, now gleamed faintly under a coating of crystallized residue that cracked like frost beneath our boots. Holmes crouched, running his gloved fingers through the dust. "No soot," he murmured. "No ash. Sublimation rather than burning. The vapor condenses, then vanishes, leaving only this mineral breath behind." He moved from beam to beam, examining each surface with almost reverent attention, until he reached a row of iron canisters stacked near the collapsed stair. One of them had split open, revealing its contents, a fine, silvery powder. He dipped the edge of his knife into it and held it close to the light. The particles shimmered with an inner glow, like dust motes catching the sun. "Mercuric alloy, bound with arsenic," he said. "The same that Vondracek employed in Prague. He has refined it into vapor form, capable of turning any confined space into a crucible. It was never meant merely to breathe. It was meant to replace breath." I felt a tremor pass through me. "You mean poison?" He shook his head. "Not poison, transformation. The ultimate inversion, matter becoming air, and air becoming matter. A man could vanish into his own breath, leaving behind only the ghost of metal." At that moment, a faint creak echoed through the rafters, followed by a shuffle of steps above us. Holmes stiffened. "We are not alone," he whispered. We moved cautiously through the ruin until we reached a narrow stair that twisted upward into the shadows. A door hung half open at the landing. Holmes gestured for silence, then pushed it wide. The room beyond was small, lined with shelves of instruments and notebooks. A single lamp burned low upon a table, illuminating a figure hunched over a ledger. He turned at our entrance, blinking through spectacles thick as bottle glass. It was Lestrade. "For heaven's sake," I exclaimed, "you nearly gave us heart failure." The inspector exhaled, relieved. "Thank the Lord it's you. I've been here since dawn, cataloguing what's left. It's a madhouse of foreign scribble and chemical nonsense." He gestured toward the papers. "But there's one thing you'll want to see." He handed Holmes a page torn from a notebook. Across it ran a precise diagram of human lungs rendered in cross-section, their bronchi replaced by pipes, their alveoli by gears. Beneath it, in English, were the words, "Phase 3, distribution through the air itself. Holmes studied it in silence, then laid it carefully upon the table. He wished to render London his laboratory, he said at last, an entire city breathing in synchrony with his invention. Lestrade gave a nervous laugh. You make it sound like the end of the world. Holmes looked up sharply. Inspector, it is the nature of endings to disguise themselves as improvements. When men dream of perfection, they seldom wake peacefully. He turned to me. Watson, help me with these crates. We must determine whether the mechanism survived the blast. We pried open several of the remaining containers. Most were empty, but one revealed a compact device of brass and glass, about the size of a man's heart. Tubes coiled from its surface like veins, ending in small vents capped with wire mesh. Holmes examined it closely. A portable generator, he said, designed to release the vapor in measured doses. I dare say it could be operated by anyone with a spark. Lestrade frowned. And you think there are more of these? Undoubtedly. The pattern suggests serial manufacture. 4, at least. 1 for Clerkenwell, 1 for St. Jude's, 1 here, and perhaps 1 yet unfound. He straightened, his expression grim. If so, the city may already be breathing its final sample. A silence fell among us. Only the distant lap of the river against the pilings broke it. Then, from somewhere beneath the floor came a faint hiss. Steady, measured, almost human. Lestrade paled. Good Lord, not again. Holmes held up a hand. No panic. This one feeds outward, not inward. He knelt, pressing his ear to the boards. Yes, the current runs toward the dock wall. Someone built an exhaust pipe to vent the vapor into the Thames. Deliberately? I asked. Deliberately, Holmes said. Vondracek or one of his disciples realized too late what they had unleashed and sought to drown it. Whether they succeeded depends on how deep the river runs. He rose, brushing the dust from his coat. We have learned all we can here. Come. There is one place left where the truth must surface. Lestrade frowned. Where's that? The printing house of the Strand, said Holmes. A letter was sent from that office 3 nights ago, addressed to Karel Vondracek, C.O. St. Jude's Cathedral. It was intercepted by the Yard, but never opened. I suspect the sender was none other than our watchmaker's missing accomplice. The D.I. hand that carried the last formula through London's veins. The sky outside had begun to darken by the time we reached Fleet Street. Rain threatened, but did not fall. The foreman of the press, a stooped man with ink-stained fingers, received us nervously. Yes, sir, he said. We printed a letter for a foreign gentleman, a sort of circular with drawings. He paid in gold, told us to post it on the 9th, then vanished. Left this behind. He rummaged in a drawer and produced a thin metal cylinder, sealed at both ends. Holmes accepted it with care. A pneumatic cartridge, he said. The kind used in certain continental presses to convey proofs. Ingenious and dangerous if misused. He weighed it in his palm, then held it close to his ear. A faint vibration thrummed within. Still active, he whispered. Watson, fetch a pail of water. I obeyed at once. Holmes submerged the tube, and a stream of tiny bubbles escaped from one end, hissing softly. The sound dwindled, then ceased. When he drew it forth again, it was inert. He opened it with a twist of his knife. Inside lay a roll of fine parchment, perfectly dry. Upon it, in Lemming's familiar hand, was written a single line. If you find this, breathe not the dust of my invention. Let it die as men die. In silence. Holmes folded the paper without a word. For a long while he stood motionless, staring into the wet street beyond the door, where the fog swirled like smoke from an unseen fire. At last he said, There will be no arrests, no headlines, no applause. Only the quiet that follows when a city forgets it was ever in danger. He turned to me and his eyes in the dim light looked strangely weary. "But remember this, Watson. London will always breathe, and in its breath lies every sin we bury. One day the air itself may accuse us." We stepped back into the night. The fog closed around us with almost tender familiarity, its vapor cold but oddly clean, as though, at least for now, the city had exhaled its poison and chosen to live. The river by night is a conscience. It remembers what the streets pretend to forget, and on that bleak evening, with the tide idling sullenly against the pilings and the fog hanging low as a guilty thought, Holmes declared that memory would serve us better than law. He had stood for a long time at our window, watching the chimney smoke flatten and slide along the roofs as if reluctant to rise, and then he turned with that abruptness which signals a decision already tested and proved within. "Come, Watson," he said. "If a man wishes to vanish, he goes where breath is borrowed and returned, the river. And if a man wishes to make a point, he goes back to the first sentence he ever wrote." Limehouse. We took a cab only so far as Bishopsgate, dismissing it at the lip of that maze of lanes whose lamps were halos of grease. From there we walked, Holmes's pace unhurried but exact, as though he had given himself the problem of arriving at a particular plank between two particular pilings at the precise instant when the river would draw a certain breath. The night smelt of wet rope, rust and eel. Distant bells shuddered behind the fog like frightened cattle. Once, the shape of a constable's cape loomed and vanished. Twice, the shadow of a figure leaned from a warehouse window and withdrew. The water spoke in syllables, slap, hush, suck, as if the city had taught it a language for secrets. Lestrade's corpse, Holmes murmured at last, was an answer to a question we had not had the courage to ask. What question was that? I kept my voice low. It seemed a discourtesy to raise it above the whisper of the tide. "Whether Elias Croft preferred justice to judgment," he said. "The body told us nothing certain save that copper floats to the surface of a policeman's mind faster than truth. No family identified it, no scar on the right wrist which Croft acquired at Clerkenwell, and the shells at the ears were not his workmanship. He sold himself a funeral and paid in counterfeit grief." "You mean he lives?" "I mean he intends to choose the hour of his death himself," Holmes replied. "And he will choose it standing where the city's breath mingles with its sin." We reached a narrow causeway of slick timbers that led between two rotting sheds to a patch of shingle the river had stolen and returned 1,000 times. There, half swallowed in the mist, stood a figure whose outline I knew by the angle of the head before the copper flashed at the ears. He did not start when we drew near. He did not even turn. He merely raised one gloved hand to the air before him as though measuring the river's note, and then lowered it again, satisfied. "Good evening, Mr. Croft," Holmes said. "Your funeral was very affecting." Croft's voice came roughened, as ever, by the misfortune that had tuned it. "It brought kind silence, Mr. Holmes. A man needs silence in which to finish a promise." "You promised what? Revenge? Or merely an end?" "An end," he said, and at that word he did turn, the copper shells catching a stray lamplight, the ruin of the cheek gentled by fog. "You must not think me murderer, because I have made myself undertaker. There are machines still breathing that have no right to, and men listening for them who have not yet paid the price of their hearing. Meeks is one such man." The name we had let fall and not followed came back at us with the bite of a neglected debt. "The river warehouse man," I said. "The trader in the Ghost of Fire." "Trader, yes," Croft answered, "but only by necessity. He is a maker by nature. He does not understand use, he understands only proof. He sold to Lemming what he should have thrown into the sea. And now he has kept back a last instrument for himself." Holmes's eyes had not left Croft's face, but his voice moved on ahead of us, feeling for obstacles in the dark. "A portable generator," he said, "no larger than a man's heart, rigged to vent through mesh, the fourth of 4. Croft inclined his head once. "He means to test it in the heart of the fog." He says the air is God's laboratory. He means the poor man's lungs. I told him I would stop him. He showed me the river and said, "Stop that first. You see how machines make philosophers of fools." "Where?" Holmes asked. Croft gestured with his chin to the left-hand shed. "Within. He waits for the tide to turn so that the breath runs upriver and not down. He wishes to know whether the thing climbs as eagerly as it falls." Holmes's hand went to his pocket and came away with nothing more threatening than a pair of thin leather gloves. He drew them on with the attentiveness of a surgeon, each finger seated with a pinch. "Then we must reverse the proof," he said. "Watson, keep behind me. Mr. Croft, if you have come to finish your promise, remember that the law must wake to its responsibilities, even if it sleeps through invention." "The law wakes to rope and gallows," Croft said. "It sleeps through vapor." Holmes, who could be as hard as steel and as sudden as flame, did not answer. He pushed the shed door inward, and the smell met us first, a faint, sweet metal tang over clean cold. A lantern burned low on a crate, and beside it sat Meeks. He was a man of middling size and comfortable prosperity, the sort whose face is identical in every port, and whose eyes have learned to pass over policemen without sticking. But his hands betrayed him. They were bright with the polish of the lathe, and the cuff of his coat bore a glimmer of that silvery dust we had fetched from a split canister. On the table lay the device I had seen in the ruined warehouse, a little engine coiled like a sleeping animal, its vents capped by gauze, a slender wire trailing to a hand lever. He did not rise. He looked from Croft to Holmes and then to me with a respectful, almost grateful curiosity one reserves for interested onlookers. "You came," he said. His voice had the flat satisfaction of an experimenter who watches for the one additional factor that will push his measure from probable to certain. "Good. Witnesses give shape to results." "Mr. Meeks," Holmes said, "witnesses give shape to trials, and trials to sentences. I advise you not to mistake London for your smokehouse." Meeks smiled in the way of a man who has no quarrel with morality so long as it stands behind the rope. "Sir, I am engineer, not murderer. I seek behavior. The thing behaves when the air is damp. I wish to know if it behaves the same in fog. I will vent a thimbleful through the mesh and close it again. You will observe nothing but the movement of a candle flame and the merest alteration of odor." "And the lungs of the dockmen?" I asked sharply. He spread his hands, palms pale under the lantern's smear. "The dose is minute. I am not unkind. Besides, the poor have stronger constitutions than gentlemen. Everyone says so." Holmes stepped nearer to the table, and I saw that peculiar softening of his face which presages contempt so complete it can afford to be courteous. "You mistake the nature of breath, Mr. Meeks," he said gently. "It is not merely a vehicle. It is a covenant. When you alter it, you break a promise no man has the right to touch." "I alter nothing," Meeks returned. "I reveal." "Then let us reveal something together," Holmes said in the same low tone. "Let us reveal whether your device behaves under another condition. Resistance." Before Meeks could reply, Croft moved. I do not know how he crossed the space so swiftly with that damaged knee, but his hand was at the lever, and his other clamped over the little engine as a smith grips a hot shoe. Meeks snarled, an animal sound unbecoming to his tidy coat, and struck Croft's forearm. The copper shells chimed once, sharp as a struck coin. The device rocked. The lever danced half a degree. A faint, colorless thread of breath crept from the mesh. Holmes's left hand came down upon the wire. His right snapped the lantern lid shut, drowning the flame. In the instant of blackness, the device whispered, no louder than a tooth-drawing air, and the room filled with a sweetness that was not a scent so much as an idea of warmth. I felt my tongue dry in my mouth. Croft's grip tightened until the leather gloves creaked. "It climbs," Meeks breathed, not to us, but to himself, and would have opened the lantern in his excitement had Holmes's wrist not found his with surgical precision. They stood so for the span of 3 heartbeats, Meeks trembling with eagerness, Holmes immovable. Croft bowed over the thing as if confessing to it. Then Holmes spoke, calm and very clear. "Watson, the door." I felt for the latch and flung it wide. "Now, Mr. Croft, toward the river." Croft understood. With an effort that drew a hiss from his teeth, he lifted the device to his breast, cradling the vents toward his own ruined cheek, and stumbled for the threshold. Meeks lunged. I met him with the shoulder the army had trained for closer work than medicine. He fetched up against the table and slid, sprawling as Croft broke into the open. The fog took the breath from the little engine and made it visible at last, a pale wreath coiling upon the air like a ghost that could not decide whether to haunt the lungs or the moon. Croft reeled down the slimy steps to the shingle, waded to the shin, then to the thigh. The river, which can be cruel, was kind. It cupped him, took the engine from his arms when he thrust it low, and answered with a shuddering sigh like a bellows letting go after long misuse. Meeks had gained his feet. He tore free of me with the surprising strength of those polished hands, and would have followed Croft, had Holmes not set 2 fingers in the precise purchase at the man's elbow that masters use on restive horses. "No," Holmes said. "Look, learn, then choose whether you wish to be engineer or executioner." We looked. The fog over the water thinned where the breath dissolved. The thread of sweetness snapped. In its place came only river, mud and old iron and the cold that cleans men whether they will or no. Croft stood waist-deep, the copper shells dark as drowned coins, the engine slack in his hands like a heart that had done its last work. He turned his face up to us. Even at that distance, I saw the relief cut into it. No triumph, only the exhaustion of a promise kept. "Come back, man," I shouted without thinking. "You'll take a chill." He smiled and shook his head. "I am a chill," he called hoarsely. "The kind that takes men when fire has left them." Then his eyes found Holmes. "No gallows," he said. "No headlines. Only the right ending." Holmes's voice went out over the water slow and even, like a rope paid carefully from a coil. "There are 2 endings, Mr. Croft. One you choose, one you do not. Come in, and I will put you before a magistrate who has grandchildren and a fear of gas in his own walls. You will speak plainly. Meeks will be tried for unlawful endangerment, and the rest will be buried under words longer than the machines that deserved them. Or remain, and I swear to you the river will tell your story to no one." Meeks made a sound between a laugh and a sob. "This is folly. The city needs men who can—" Holmes did not turn. "Hush. You have done enough speaking through other men's breath." Croft's gaze dropped to the little engine in his hands. He lifted it tenderly, and with a motion almost devout, he dropped it into the current. It bobbed once, twice, then sank, as if the river had remembered a debt and taken payment in full. He came toward us then, slow with cold, but steady with decision, and when his boots found the stairs, Holmes held out a hand and took him, not as a captor takes, but as a climber does another man's weight. Meeks, seeing the moment tilt beyond retrieval, snatched at the mesh cap that had rolled from the table and made for the door. I confess I was 2 steps slow. The blow I had given him had cooled my blood, but not his. He slipped past and ran, swift in that rabbit way of the well-fed when hunted, vanishing toward the warren of alleys where fog mothers many sons. Holmes did not follow. He wrapped his coat about Croft's shoulders, looked once down the lane where Meeks had gone, and shook his head. "Justice," he said softly, "prefers a crowd. Tonight we have only the river and our consciences. Perhaps that is enough." We walked Croft along the causeway and into the wider lane where the lamps fought more bravely. His teeth chattered and his hands had gone a terrible color, but he kept his feet. "I will go where you say," he managed. "I will tell them what I've done and what I stopped. I will tell them Lemming was not a Murderer, but a child who mistook a match for a star. Holmes's face altered at the name. Something passed over it quick as the wing of a night bird. "Tell them the truth," he said, "and if they do not know what to do with it, I will." From the river came a last small sound, the sort a man makes when sleep overtakes him sitting up. The fog took it and made of it a blanket for the sheds, for the stairs, for the little place where a device had gone down content to be nothing now. We turned our faces toward Bishopsgate, and the city, which had held its breath as if listening to its own heart, exhaled. We had not gone 50 yards before a bell somewhere upstream tolled once, an echo perhaps from St. Jude's, or merely the metal throat of a freight buoy bumping a piling in the slack water. Holmes paused, and I knew by the tilt of his head that he heard not the bell, but what lay behind it, the end of a design and the beginning of its cost. "Watson," he said, very low, "there remains one ember on our hearth, and I have not yet decided whether to let it die." I knew what he meant. The half-burned scrap, the unposted confession, the line between the invention and the man, the line between letting a city sleep and waking it with a story that would make it cough. We went on. The lamps ahead wrote their usual grammar in the mist. Comma, pause, period. Behind us, the river turned in its bed and drew a longer breath, as if settling for the night. The following days passed, as if the city itself had forgotten how to move. The fog withdrew in weary tatters, revealing London pale and unshaven beneath it, like a man who has survived an illness but lost his strength. From the windows of Baker Street, I watched the chimneys breathe once more, timidly, upward this time as though uncertain of permission. Holmes had said little since the night by the river. The copper shells that Croft had worn lay upon our mantelpiece, burnished now to a dull gleam by Holmes's polishing cloth. Beside them sat the half-burned scrap of parchment we had recovered from the hearth, the one that bore the words, "If I fall silent, remember the sound of the breath." He had not spoken of Croft's trial, nor of Meeks's disappearance, though both had made the papers briefly before being buried under newer scandals. The Times called it a regrettable affair of scientific misadventure, and the Yard closed its file with bureaucratic haste. Holmes, however, could not. It was the third evening after the river incident when I found him kneeling before the hearth, the copper shells in his hands. The fire burned low, its light restless upon the walls. "Watson," he said without looking up, "tell me, do you believe that memory possesses weight?" I hesitated. "Weight, Holmes?" "Yes, that a thought, once formed, must rest somewhere, even after its owner is gone. We speak of minds as though they are air, fleeting, incorporeal, but I think perhaps they leave traces, invisible as breath, but no less real. The world seems lighter when fools perish, heavier when good men die. Perhaps Croft's invention only mimicked what nature already performs." He rose and placed the shells upon the mantel. "He wished to give machinery remembrance, Watson, to make it recall the act of breathing as life itself. He succeeded only in showing that men forget far too easily what breathing means." I saw then the exhaustion that had settled upon him, the kind of fatigue that comes not from labor, but from reflection. "You have carried this matter too far upon your shoulders, Holmes," I said. "Let it rest. The city is safe. The fire is quenched." He gave a small, mirthless laugh. "Safe, yes, but not cured. The contagion remains, in ideas, in ambition, in the quiet fever of invention that burns behind every shuttered workshop. You cannot arrest curiosity, my dear fellow. You can only delay it." The clock struck 10. Outside, the rattle of a passing cab broke the stillness. Then came a sound I had not heard in weeks, the firm, deliberate knock of someone who knew exactly whose door he disturbed. Mrs. Hudson entered a moment later, her face pale. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said. "He would not give his name." The visitor was tall and gaunt, wrapped in a dark overcoat slick with rain. He carried no umbrella, though the water beaded upon his shoulders like quicksilver. When he removed his hat, I recognized him with a start. "Vondracek," I whispered. Holmes's brows lifted, though his expression remained composed. "We read of your death, sir." The man smiled faintly. "One of several. The river returns what it pleases." He stepped closer to the fire. "I have come not to haunt you, Mr. Holmes, but to ask for the thing you took." "The thing I took?" Vondracek nodded toward the mantel. "The shells. They belong to me." Holmes regarded him coolly. "To Croft, you mean? He gave his life to destroy your work." The Czech inclined his head. "A necessary act, though not the final one. The breath still lingers. It is drawn into the air. It will fade with time, but I would hasten its passing. The alloy within those shells reacts to the compound. It consumes the trace when heated." Holmes studied him for a long moment. "And if I refuse? Then London will continue to breathe ghosts." Without a word, Holmes lifted the shells and handed them across. Vondracek held them carefully, almost tenderly, as though accepting an infant from the arms of its mother. "You have my thanks," he said. "Tell your police that the age of miracles is over." He turned to go. I moved to stop him, but Holmes raised a hand. "Let him pass, Watson. He carries no weapon but his conscience." When the door closed behind him, Holmes returned to his chair. "You see," he said softly, "even death hesitates before a man who believes he has created life." I stared at the empty hearth. "What will you do now?" He smiled faintly. "What I always do. Observe, deduce, and, when possible, forget. The last is hardest." He leaned back, folding his hands. "I think I shall take a case of theft or adultery. Something wholesome. Something human." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind shifted. For a long while, neither of us spoke. Then Holmes rose once more and took up the poker. He stirred the embers gently, and one bright coal detached itself, rolling to the edge of the grate. He watched it with that curious blend of detachment and fascination peculiar to him. "Strange, is it not?" he murmured. "How a dying fire clings to form. One might almost believe it resists the inevitable." He bent and returned the ember to the flame. It caught at once, glowing fiercely, then softened into ash. "There," he said. "Even the smallest spark knows when to let go." I wrote my account of the case some weeks later, though Holmes forbade its publication. "The public," he said, "prefers its ghosts tidy and its miracles complete. Let them keep both." And so the tale remained in my drawer, unread, its pages yellowing with the slow breath of time. Yet sometimes, when the fog presses against the windows and the fire burns low, I fancy I see that thin wisp of smoke curling downward rather than up, a whisper of remembrance, or warning, or both. Holmes, sitting in his chair across the hearth, seldom notices my gaze. But once, on a night like this, he caught my reflection in the window and said quietly, "You need not watch the smoke, Watson. It remembers us well enough." He smiled then, tired but alive, and turned back to his violin. The first notes rose soft as breath, trembling like the ember's final glow, before surrendering to silence. And through that silence, faint but certain, London breathed again.